Sorry. So, looking at this third slide, the history and the terms of policy. As you know, and again, this book, when you start reading Fowler, and I've had a chance to read it completely, you'll realize that it's really mostly just common sense stuff that you already know. Just because the fact that you've been in public schools and you've dealt with politicians and you've dealt with policies and rules and procedures, this is really pretty much common sense stuff in all of the Fowler's books. Most of the policies that we in the public sector in North Carolina, those of us who work in the public schools, we know, and here's how the realistic thing when you start looking at policies. I don't know how all the school districts represented here do their policies, but I can almost guarantee you that it's the same way Caldwell County Schools does ours. We contract with the North Carolina School Boards Association, and they create a policy manual. And that policy manual is tied to the State Board of Education's policy manual, so everything is quite consistent. So your Board of Education probably does about 5% of policies on its own. If they subscribe to the North Carolina School Boards Association, the reality is the North Carolina School Boards Association sends them a policy, they approve it, they may change it a little bit. The School Boards Association, they send it back. The School Boards Association will say, no, you can't do this because you're breaking the law, or they will adopt it. And most school districts, and I don't know about Burke or Elkin or Wilkes, but I think the vast majority of the school districts in the state do contract with the North Carolina School Boards Association, and that is about 95% of your policies. If you've looked at one of your board meetings lately, or if you've attended one, those policies that are making their way through, those are required by state law or by new regulations by the federal government. And your school board and superintendent, or whoever works with the superintendent's office in putting together these policies, they really are just flow-throughs. And that's the truth about policy here in North Carolina. Most of the education policy is driven by the General Assembly, driven by the statutes and the laws that they put in place. And I'll tell you, if you're a superintendent and you watch this during the summer, there is a big, big push during the summer months to find out what the General Assembly is doing. Because in North Carolina, over the last 10, 15 years, the General Assembly of this state has gotten to writing policy for school systems. That's not the way it used to be. And so whenever someone runs to one of your General Assembly members, they may go and they say, you know, my child is epileptic. The school didn't do this, or my school didn't do that. If they get enough voice, and they have enough voice with that General Assembly member, I can almost guarantee you there's going to be some training for teachers in the General Assembly laws over the next session. That's how we get most of these quirky little things we get from the North Carolina General Assembly. It's because someone knows, goes to church, good friends, has dinner every week with one of the General Assembly members, and they plant that bug in their head, and that's how we get policies. And sometimes you may wonder, well, where did that come from? Because it doesn't go through the traditional policy route in North Carolina, which is committees talk about it. It generally goes into the budget. And so when that budget is published and it's finalized, we have to go through it to find out exactly what we have to do now. So you probably have some really good examples over the last couple of years. So policies are generally in North Carolina, particularly educational policies, are enacted by the North Carolina General Assembly. They are in response to, the rules and regulations are in response to those policies. And it used to be that when the General Assembly got into the policy realm, they would just leave it at that. They would send it to the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. They would develop some policies. They'd send them down to the local LEAs. That's really not the way it is now, because the General Assembly even gets into writing some of the regulations and rules. But when your Board of Education passes a policy, somewhere within there will be language that says the superintendent or his designees will develop the regulations to go with this policy. There is some flexibility in that. So the regulations are in response to the policies. The regulations also tell you how people feel about the policies, or will give you an idea of what that policy is really about. An example. The North Carolina General Assembly gives us a policy. I mean, they may call it, they'll put some pretty name to it, like no child going hungry. But in reality, the real purpose and the best way to look at how that policy is real purpose of it, no matter what its name might be, is to see the ramifications of what that policy does. Like, does it cap the number of free and reduced lunch children in your school? Does it cap the amount that the state will send for, or the federal government will send for free and reduced children? So really the best cue is how the policy is, the regulations that are written to the policy. Look at how they're written. Policies can be written broadly or they can be written narrowly. You really want to, as a superintendent or a school leader, you really do like the broadly written policies. They give you a lot of flexibility, a lot of leeway. You can kind of put your own touch to it. Unfortunately, most of the policies coming out of Raleigh now or from the State Board of Education are narrowly written. You don't have very much leeway at all, and that's really by design. They just really are micromanaging. And of course, you've heard about court cases, or case law, all decided by constitutional, either the North Carolina Supreme Court or the United States Supreme Court. All right, let's talk about policy implementation and how it actually makes its way down. The implementation of policy, of course, is close to the top. Those people who make the policy are generally the ones at the top. You would hope that they've had some feedback. You would hope that they've heard from different people. You would hope that they've debated it. You would hope they've considered the pros and cons. I mean, all that goes into a well-written policy. Do you kind of get a feel for why the North Carolina General Assembly, and I'm not going to bash them all night, but if you want me to, I can do a whole lot worse than this. That's why the policies, oftentimes you have to have something go back and be modified. It is rare now that we get a policy out of the state required by the General Assembly that we don't have modifications or things that come about to explain what they were trying to do, because they're not given a lot of thought through the process. Policies are developed at the top, but the implementation really does depend on those of us in the middle and certainly in the grassroots. An example, if the state of North Carolina has a new policy about AIG services, that policy will be sent to your local Board of Education. Your local Board of Education will kind of fine tune it if they can. But then it goes to the school and to that AIG teacher for the implementation of it. You know as well as I do that the fidelity is a big issue, because that AIG teacher may say, I've been doing it this way for 30 years and my kids are super. So why do I want to add this new component to it? So just because it's a policy really doesn't mean that it's being implemented. It really doesn't mean that it is being done with fidelity. The other big component to this too is sometimes when you have a policy, you need to watch to see whether or not what the government does about it, what kind of government action or inaction. The book went into great detail about the civil rights, the Brown versus the Board of Education, and how Southern states, their inaction, even though the Supreme Court in 1954 said that you had to integrate your schools with immediate speed, how the Southern states, through their inaction, that should be inaction. Oh, I'll fix that. Going the wrong way. Through their inaction was not following the policy. So that's an important component too, is that just because, again, you have a policy doesn't mean that people are going to do it. And the best example was the civil rights movement. Think about some of the other issues that are coming at you fast and furious: transgender rights, gay and lesbian students' rights, kneeling at the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem. All of these things policy may be developed at the federal level and then passed at the state level. But really, when you really get down to it, those of us at the grassroots and the middle level are the ones who have to implement it. And if people don't like it, they will sabotage it, just like the Southern state governments did during the civil rights movement. Okay, public policy transformation. The chapter spent quite a bit talking about the way it has changed over the past couple of years. And I, for one, would like to go back to the pre-1980s, when public schools and staff members were respected and they were asked for their opinions. Teachers were held in high regard. When there was a new policy or procedure coming down the pipeline, teachers were involved in it. All of that was prior to the 1980s. Ronald Reagan, and great president, no doubt for many people, but in the 1980s, all of that changed. And Since then, the government has been on and not just the federal government, but the state and local governments too, they've been on this kick that public schools are failing. And, you don't have to go far or long to hear a report on the news. I mean, they try to compare us to other places when there's really no comparison. So since the 1980s, we just need to know that the public opinion is being molded by our business, our media, and our politicians, and they do consider us to be in crisis for whatever reasons. They're starving us. We don't get the money we want. There's a lot of competition, and we're not the only show in or the only game in town anymore. They've allowed for privatization and other things to take place. Also in the 1980s, the federal government really tried to get rid of public education. They wanted to continue the funding, but they wanted to push it down to the states. And so what you saw during the Reagan era and later on, even in Bill Clinton, somewhat up into the Obama era, don't know what Trump's doing, but then you saw more of a push down to the states to begin to do more decisions about public education. Now, the federal government still sends quite a bit of money, certainly not enough, but since then, the state governments have been taking over a lot of the decision-making process, but there's where it stopped. State governments have enjoyed getting these federal pots of money, and they have enjoyed being able to distribute it, and they are also taking over more and more responsibilities for policies and procedures. So, final point on this page or this sheet is that more often than not, politicians see us as the problem. Whether you belong to NCAE or any of our organizations, politicians aren't very nice to us. They really do see us as the roadblock. If you disagree, so super, we'll talk about it in a moment. So in the 1980s, why did it change? It wasn't just Ronald Reagan, but it was a whole concept that about no taxes or lower the taxes. I mean, you most of your career, if not all of it, has been spent under this umbrella of we've got to reduce taxes, no more new taxes, read my lips, all of that, no new taxes. So it's been a kind of a crusade where you've got to do more with less. And the only way, because public education takes so much of taxes, that when you start talking about lowering your taxes, it means that we're going to have to lower what we contribute to public education. There are demographic changes. Most of the baby boomers are retiring. Politicians who have to deal with this stuff are very worried about pension plans. Keep your fingers crossed. North Carolina is still in top rating shape, so by the time you retire, you should be okay. But politicians worry about that stuff. They call them unfunded mandates. And that's why for the new teachers coming in, I mean, think about the deal the state gave you when you signed on in North Carolina, and think about what it does now for new teachers. And as the trend continues, the benefits of becoming a teacher and being a state employer are going to decrease more and more. But baby boomers are retiring. The population is aging. People no longer have children or grandchildren in the public school system or in school systems. And when that happens, or less people, when that happens, it doesn't become a priority for them. Underlying all of that, I believe too, and if you disagree with me, that's super. I hope it is that I am wrong, but also with that aging population, I think that that tied in with the changing diversity of our population is becoming, it's a sense that they're not my children, maybe because they don't look like them, or they don't necessarily have the same values or whatever. But I think with the aging population and the diversity of the population, you're seeing more of a disconnect between how people really feel about the public schools. And honestly, in my mind, I think it has to be with the fact that the new school population really doesn't look like the population that our baby boomers went to school with. And so those grandmas are saying, perhaps, I hope that's not totally hopefully that's not the reason, but it may very well be. You also know, and you're no stranger to the fact that you've got to do a whole lot more bilingual. Everywhere you go, there's just a push to change the scope and focus of school policies. You have to look at number 6, which is the rise of groups that are very conservative and they want to change policies their way. or they want to have that impact. They don't like some of the equalization in public schools, so they want to privatize it. And finally, the the tone has changed. If you watched any of the Senate hearings last night for confirmation of the Supreme Court hearing for that judge, you'll see that there's very little civility in our national debate, and that carries over when they start talking about policy too and start public education. On page 12 in your book, if you have it, just spend some time looking at the interesting pro-con debate about keeping politics out of education. I really like that. But there's really a quote that I am going to unmute you, and you must answer to this one. Yes, here it is. As school leaders, how is your role changing? Of course, if the federal government is giving you more and more regulations, they're pushing more to the state, they're giving more hands-on by the state. So what has your role changed? Well, one, the state has not given you a lot more responsibilities, but if you're a superintendent or in any kind of leadership role, you are that day of sitting at your desk and managing that school and let the world go by you is gone. You not only have to be out there, you're going to have to be a statesman, you're going to have to be a politician, you're going to have to be a strategist. Your role is completely changed, and that's just not the superintendent. That is your role. All right, now here's where I want some comments from you. All right, on page 13 in the second paragraph, I'll read you this in case you don't have your book, but you've got to comment. I cannot let this go by. All right. In a study of female superintendents and women who aspired to become superintendents, Bruner and Grogan in 2007, so it's fairly recent, found that almost 30% of the women in their sample believed that the perception that women are weak politically was a major barrier to being hired for the position. Weigh in. Are women weak? You can't do the politics? Come on.
No, women aren't weak.
Can you play on the same level playing ground as a male superintendent? Or
absolutely.
Male? All right. Well, good for you, because this research, 30% of the women feel like they can't be an effective superintendent because they don't do the politics well. Do you all think you do the politics well? I mean, really, you're all in positions that revolve some politics. You got to please somebody. You got to play politics with the parents. You got to play politics with the superintendent. You got to do the school board. I mean, you all are really, in all your positions, you are in positions where you've got people coming at you all the time that you got to please. So being a woman is not going to keep you from that role. Good deal. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad none of you are in that 30%. I'd be extremely disappointed.
Dr. Stone, can I ask a clarifying question?
Yes.
So did you say that 30% of these females were or are superintendents, or this is just their opinion?
This is a study of female superintendents and aspiring superintendents.
Okay, so they're actually in the role.
Right, some of them, 30% aspiring. So these are folks who are already in the role. Isn't that kind of, I can tell you from my perspective of being a superintendent that politics plays a huge role. I mean, I spent probably 50% of my time just dealing with problems of politics, not to mention problems with the principal or the schools going on, but it really is very political, and I would hate to think that women don't feel equipped to deal with that, and was very disappointed to read that 30% of people, like you say, who are already in that position or who are aspiring to that position, already having that perception that they can't play ball on a political field. That's scary. I'm glad to know none of you are like that, so good. The building principle. How has your role changed? You've got to become dealing with state mandates, state players. You've got to take on a public leadership. If you're looking at standard 7 and your evaluation, micro-political, that's kind of to me what it really is being able to understand that political climate, your place in it. And you're going to have to play games with others. You're going to have to be able to play on the team and play that game. If I'm taking more than 10 minutes, you can't. Okay, I'm sure I've done more than 10 minutes on my chapter, so when you get to do yours, you're going to have to talk less than or 10 to 15. Policy issues, again, I won't belabor this, but there are different stages to the policy. Policy definition, that's got to be when it's something that can be solved or when it's got enough people who have raised it to that level of concern. And that's not just you because you're concerned. It's when you have a group of people who say, we have a problem, we need a policy. And it's got to be one that policymakers can say, well, it can be solved, like, curing cancer. Right now, that needs to be, that hasn't been addressed through public policy because there's a perception that it can't be addressed. But once we get better along with that and more cures and opportunities are found, that will change too. Any of you remember The Nation at Risk? That report in 1993. Were you around? You're showing your age then if you were around, because I was around. And it was a game changer for all of us. Those of us in public education, it was like the first slap of many that we got, because that report really kind of pushed the government to say, okay, you guys have been doing this along yourself. You've been kind of managing yourself. You've been kind of in charge of your own policies and procedures. So now it's going to change. And in 1993, it did. They started adding testing and standards. It just didn't stop. We got more and more testing. We got more and more standards. No Child Left Behind into 2000s. That's the same thing. So when the government did really turn its attention to us after 1993, the emphasis has been, you guys weren't doing a very good job, so let's have tests. Let's have assessment. So at the end of this, we'll see how you rank to everyone else. And that's really what it is. Here's the standards. That's when politicians really began to look at testing, accountability. Some good things came out, of course, with No Child Left Behind. We had the ability to look at different subgroups to make sure that everybody was being moved along and addressed. So once you define the issue, which the Nation at Risk really did define it for us, then you have the formation. This is where the policymakers, the people at the top, begin to write that, and then they adopt it, sort of like No Child Left Behind in 2000. That should be capitalized too, in 2001. And then the implementation of it, here it gets very iffy. And the interesting thing about No Child Left Behind was that the states, all 50 states, had a different plan to implement No Child Left Behind. Now, for a state that perhaps wasn't as enthused about doing this, it took the Department of Education many conversations with folks, with states, and threatened to hold back the money to get the states to actually implement No Child Left Behind like the federal government had intended it for it to be. Then, of course, there is the implementation of it. Well, the chapter ends up talking about what your role is and how your role has changed. Basically, your role is no longer to be in your building or in your facility and to just manage. Now you've got to manipulate. You've got to, and I hope that you're already doing this through your local folks, through your county commissioners, as well as through your state officers. You're lobbying, you're making suggestions. You are being a part of the table. I know many of you probably are in your associations and you've given that voice. You probably have been to Raleigh. I hope a couple of you went down there for when it was, what was that, Red Day? Wear Red? Hope you were there for that. So, implementers of the policy, you're going to have to lead with fidelity. As followers of the policy, you're going to have to stay abreast of it, particularly the way in which it could impact your school and your profession. And as influence, you got to lobby. So the big takeaways from this chapter, slide number 10 for me, was that your role has evolved. Your roles have evolved. You are now in a public leadership position, which means that you're going to have to play ball with a lot of different characters, businesses, faith community, everyone. And certainly the job has gotten a lot harder. That's my takeaway from chapter 1. And I will have to tell you, in reading chapter 1, all of this was kind of stuff that I figured out or that I knew in advance. So as you start reading the next chapters, you'll see too, there's a lot of commonalities. So are there any questions about kind of the format of what we're going to do next week? Because I think I have you, 5 of you presenting, doing your 10 to 15 minute presentation on one of the chapters. Have you started reading the book yet? Anybody have an honest assessment of the book? Because I do. No one. Anybody? What do you think of that book? Wow. Is this the new one that costs so much?
Mm-hmm.
How much did it cost? You don't want to tell me.
It was $85 to rent it on Amazon.
To rent it?
So you can imagine what it costs to buy it new.
I can certainly imagine what it costs. So does everyone have access to it? Okay. All right. So the assignments, if it's hard and you don't have the book yet and you're coming up, I can certainly take pictures of my book or send you something or whatever maybe you can share. But I certainly want you to be able to enjoy the book. My takeaway from the book is, again, it's a lot of common sense stuff. It's a lot of words, very little substance. But that's just my take. We will not use that book next year if I can get away from it. So I inherit it now. So Essex, by the way, is going to be an excellent book. I've already read the chapters, the first half of the book, and it's an excellent book because it starts talking about case law, and I really like the law. And I like the laws and the policies and all that kind of guide public schools. So you're going to enjoy that one. Any questions on the PowerPoint or the main points from chapter 1? All right, let me go back to the assignments. We have Tabitha, Lakeisha, Pam, Delana.
That's right, Delana.
Delana, I'm going to get it right. And Cynthia, you're up next week. So again, 10 to 15 minutes, whatever format you want. I'll turn the program over to you, a Zoom over to you, and it's all yours. All right, any questions on that? You don't have to use PowerPoint. Just do whatever you want to do. Okay. All right. I am showing, well, it doesn't tell me how much more time I have, but there's one last thing I want to do tonight, and that is to show you the video that Dr. Laws picked out for the introductory to this course. So I think it's about a 50-minute interview, 15-minute video. It's excellent. I have watched almost all of it. I'll finish it up with you tonight. And I'm going to put that on, and if we get cut off, I will do this one more time. And I will find out before we meet next week why I can't go over 45 minutes. Any questions for me before I try to maneuver the video? All right. Is everyone there?
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay.
And it's not related to the chapters, but it's just a little brain break, I guess. Would you be interested in considering a preferred email for each of us? You know, Gardner Webb email versus our school email?
Yes. What I'll do in the future, if you will shoot me an email to Gardner Webb and tell me your preferred email.
Okay.
The way I understand Zoom, now I'm sure I can talk to somebody and we could do it a different way. Zoom, when you go into Zoom, it asks you to paste into the class roster, which are your Gmails. But I am sure someone down, or your Gardner Web, I'm sure someone down here can tell me how to do it differently. And we'll do that. But if you'll shoot me an email of your preferred, if I don't hear from you, I'll just assume it's your Gardner Web.
Okay, thank you for that.
You're welcome. And I've got, 10 minutes? Okay. Stay with free, of course. Let's see.
Dr. Stone, are you coming back on after the video?
I am not. I'm going to watch the video with you, but I am not, because I can't record it because it's a copyright violation. So I will be here, but well, it's going to take 2 more turns evidently. I'm going to have to do another Zoom after this one. So we'll do about a 5-minute break after the Zoom. Is that okay? Or is everyone clear about what next week's going to be like, other than the interruptions here? All right, let me see if I can. When we cut off, we'll come back. I'm thinking we'll be into about 8 minutes before it cuts off.
After 38 years of teaching.
Can everyone hear it?
Not yet.
It sounds like there's a little bit of volume, but
Well,
I mean, I could barely hear anything.
and I loved it up to the end.
Got it.
Can you hear it?
Yes.
Like the legislators have beaten us down. And I hope that some way we find a way to fight our way back up to the top.